For a long time, there's been fundamental concern about how our province, under both Liberal and Conservative governments, have been so-called managing the Crown lands, because they've adopted an industrial approach that really is dependent on clear-cutting, herbiciding, and converting forest into plantations, with the intent, back in 1980, to largely produce a lot of pulpwood, or wood that is of low quality, huge volumes, that could go into pulp mills to make pulp and to ultimately make paper. I like to call it the last gold rush, because clearly the rate the companies are cutting now, they cannot sustain the production just on wood supply alone. Never mind maintaining the ecological integrity of our forest ecosystems, maintaining the biological diversity of our forest ecosystems, maintaining wildlife habitat for all the animals and plants that live there. They're cutting far more now than you could if you were trying to sustain those things. This clear cut is going to be useless for 2 or 3 generations in terms of providing habitat for animals that require older forest. It's going to be useless in terms of regulating the flow of water. It will create absolutely no jobs for the foreseeable future, for generations, because it's just liquidated. This forest is gone.
The Conservation Council of New Brunswick and the NB Federation of Woodlot Owners have been very busy organizing this event so that we can all hear firsthand from scientists, economists, social policy experts, conservationists, and woodlot owners about why the government's plan for the forest must be opposed.
What's happened recently? Under the relentless pressure from Jim Irving on behalf of his company, JDI, the David Alward government has signed a contract with JDI, with Jim Irving. Now no such contract like this exists anywhere else in North America. What does it do? Well, first of all, its purpose or its intent. The intent of this contract, as it is written, is to ensure the ongoing global competitiveness and sustainability, in other words, the profitability of Irving's forestry operations on Crown lands. That's not the role of government. Why would you choose a business and make that kind of a promise and sign onto a contract for that purpose? They've done one key thing in particular, and that is to guarantee for 25 years that Irving will be able to cut a huge amount of softwood, spruce trees and fir trees from Crown land, about 2.4 million cubic meters every year. There's no other forestry company in North America that has such a guarantee. They manage a license that is 1 million hectares in size, so it's about 1/3 of all the Crown lands at this point. This is following in the wake of government foresters saying that the government's going to have to reduce the amount of wood that could be cut on Crown lands because the companies can no longer sustainably cut at the levels they've been cutting. The wood just wasn't there.
We used to have all-party committees to discuss policy for Crown land. We used to have an annual State of the Forest report. We used to have a Minister's Advisory Committee made up of stakeholders and experts in the field to advise the minister. The province used to meet, consult, and survey its stakeholders and citizens, but no more. In the last 10 years, there's been a spate of government-sponsored reports paid for with taxpayers' dollars, and they've had a slew of good ideas in them. For example, create an arm's-length special management agency of government to manage Crown land. Establish a chief forester position so forestry expertise can be guiding management, not politicians and economics. Again, arm's length. That we should establish a sustainable timber objective for private land and put in place policies to ensure we meet that volume target before we turn to Crown land for wood. That government should increase transparency on forestry issues. that we should have public hearings on Crown land management every 10 years. And nearly every report commissioned by government, including Yalkopori, has said that the government should do more public involvement and that they should do a better job of it than they have in the past. It's clear that the government does not want to give us these things or act on these good ideas that we're paid for with taxpayers' dollars. So we need to demand that our collective will is reflected in how our forest is managed. And to do that, we need to participate in the process. And unfortunately, there's no back room big enough to hold all of these people. So it needs to be undertaken out in the open, in broad daylight, and under the scrutiny of a free and diverse press, which would be really nice to have.
There's been a lot of pressure from a lot of different parts of our society for change. Proposals to create community forests, proposals to manage for lower volumes of wood but higher value wood that would create more jobs per cubic meter of wood that could be managed more on an ecologically sustainable basis. And there's been proposals to change the fundamental nature of the Crown Lands and Forests Act, which governs all of this, to ensure that it actually meets the needs of the land, meets the needs of the people, and meets the needs of our communities, and meets the needs of the future. Because, of course, government is serving as a trustee for these Crown lands. In fact, that's never been ceded by First Nations in this province, the Maliseet, the Passamaquoddy, or the Mi'kmaq. In other parts of Canada, land was transferred by treaty or sold to the government or the Crown, but that's not the case in New Brunswick. It doesn't belong to the government, it doesn't belong to anybody in a way, because First Nations never had a sense of private property. They had a sense of sharing, and when our ancestors first came to New Brunswick, they assumed that we would simply be sharing the lands like we're on today in a way that would support us both. And clearly, that's not happened. There is a sacred trust in being the stewards of this Crown land on behalf of not just all of us who live in New Brunswick today, First Nations and other New Brunswickers, but future generations, our children, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on.
This is yet another unacceptable example of short-term corporate profit taking precedence over the long-term viability of our forest, our communities, and our climate, and we're not okay with that. Yeah. So the government likes to tell us that this plan is good for New Brunswickers. They tell us it'll bring us jobs, it's going to bring us out of debt. In reality, it is nothing but a direct threat to us all, our children and our children's children.
Scientists some time ago in New Brunswick established sort of the minimum area of wildlife habitat that was required to maintain just viable populations, not thriving populations of wildlife, but viable populations of wildlife. And they've abandoned that threshold and allowed the area that's supposed to be managed for wildlife to drop well below that to free up more wood for JDI to cut. They're increasing the size of clear cuts. They're increasing the frequency of clear cuts. It used to be that you couldn't have another clear cut next door to an old clear cut for about 10 years, but now they're reducing that to 5 years.
I was a government biologist for 22 years. Since 1980, government biologists have been working to set aside wildlife habitat, and it is set aside. 30% of Crown land has been set aside, and it's what we call conservation forest. So every time you hear conservation forest, we're talking about deer yards, we're talking about buffer strips, we're talking about old growth forest. That's what they want, okay? So let's be clear, this is not just forest that's out there. This is stuff that's been set aside for 25 years for right now, because we knew this time was coming. We knew we were going to run out of wood. So we set it aside, and now that's what everyone wants to get into. However, we're always told that 30%, that was the way it was. Now we're going down to 20. We went to 28% 2 years ago. Now it's down to 23%. Let's not be fooled. 30% was not good. What happened when we had 30%? We allowed the other 70% of the forest to be managed based on what people thought was good forest management. What did that look like? We went out and we planted a lot of forest, and we herbicided that forest. And what did it do? Over my 22 years, I can tell you what it did. And this is not pie in the sky. I flew every winter in helicopters and saw what was going on in the land base. I counted the deer. We're going to slaughter 278 deer yards under this new plan. They're gone forever. You wonder why you see deer in your backyards? It's because there's not much left in the woods.
The forest management manual that they've written over decades, really, building up good practices that represent forest management, is being tossed out the window. So they're guaranteeing for 25 years this amount of wood. They're guaranteeing that they will ensure the costs for Irving to cut that wood on Crown lands will be kept to a minimum. And they're guaranteeing that the price we sell that wood to J.D. Irving at will be, in quotes, competitive, and will remain that for 25 years, however that's defined. This has been done without any engagement of First Nations, without any engagement of New Brunswick citizens. It was cooked up in the back rooms and signed off and delivered as a fait accompli.
They've been lining their pockets with the blood, sweat, and tears of the province and giving very little in return. And I think it's time that the government took back their Crown land and gave it back to the people that own it.
It's almost impossible to believe that a minister of the Crown, Paul Robichaud, the Minister of Natural Resources, has signed this contract with Jim Irving because it is irresponsible, undemocratic, and I would argue immoral for a government to sign this kind of a contract for 25 years with a single business interest, one of the most powerful and wealthy families in this country, to the detriment of New Brunswickers, First Nations, the life we share our province with, and our children, grandchildren, and their grandchildren. So that goes to show the kind of economic pressures, the kinds of threats that large players like Jim Irving can make. And we just can't go on that way. Look at the state our province is in. This is where it's got us. This government is more secretive than the last. The last government was secretive enough. The notion that the business of government is the business of the people, which is why Richard Hatfield brought the Right to Information Act into law in the first place, because that's what he said. The business of the government is the business of the people of New Brunswick. So with some very narrow exclusions, the sun should be shining in on what our government is doing.
When we look around and we just see how opaque everything is here, it's shocking. So I feel a little bit like walking tall. You know, I came back and this is my Afghan sweater, and I spent quite a bit of time in Afghanistan. And the Afghans are light years ahead of us on transparency. Their new mining law requires that every contract be published. Right? Thank goodness we have David Coon, because otherwise I'd have to send him off to Afghanistan to fight for transparency. So what we've seen is a process by which, having no transparency, no access to information, that you can essentially take any resource and do what you want with it. But the worldwide movement is now pushing towards extractive industries transparency. Canada is a big promoter of that. Everywhere in the world except for here at home. So what we've seen is in every jurisdiction in the world, you're not allowed to extract oil and gas or cut down the forest without some degree of public consultation. So where's that here? So we're not a banana republic. We're far worse, because any banana republic wouldn't put up with this stuff, but we're willing to, right? And how do they do it? They do it through the politics of fear. Give us what you want or the job's getting. Well, guess what? Natural resources are in demand all over the world. We don't have to give it away for free. It's time for us to stand up and say enough is enough. If you don't want to give us our resources at a fair price, we'll find somebody else who will. And that is what's happening all over the world. You can't do this anymore. You can do it only in a nice developed country like Canada and a wonderful province like New Brunswick can you get away with this sort of stuff. And I think that enough is enough. And that's why.
So here we have a situation where this company that they've inked this deal with owns almost all of the print media in New Brunswick. How are we supposed to have a good, informed discussion about what we should be doing with regard to Crown lands? Because the information is, in some sense, controlled. So this issue is really not just about forests and forest-based businesses and wildlife and the environment, water and air and the land. But it really is about the freedom of New Brunswickers to determine their own destiny. And with the stroke of a pen, the David Alward government has signed that freedom away.
Well, I'm a woodlot owner. I've got some wood ground. But what about our children and our grandchildren? I just don't know why they got to get it all. I'm not too happy with what's going on with the big forestry companies or the government, liberal or conservative. They've both done nothing to help the small guy. I mean, we can go to them, and I've spoke to them. But what are we getting? We're not getting anything. It hurts.
The other thing it does is prevent new businesses from starting up who might be able to create more jobs in local communities using forest resources from the Crown lands, because there won't be any wood available to them. It's all locked up for 25 years. It kills competition then, of course, and in that sense is a job killer, because businesses that potentially could create far more jobs per cubic meter of wood that got cut won't be able to start up or won't be able to expand. And so that's all off. That's what this contract does. It handcuffs future governments and the citizens of this province from actually changing anything in terms of how the Crown lands are utilized, whether it is to improve or restore some of the conservation measures, to address questions of ecological integrity, biological diversity, water protection, water regulation, creating new opportunities for new business startups, creating new opportunities to create new jobs. That is all off. So we need a party in the legislature which has the courage and the strength of their convictions and the best interests of the common good at heart to stand up and say, no, we need to go in this direction. That is in the best interest of the public good. We need a party that says we're going to work with the people of New Brunswick. We're going to collaborate with the people of New Brunswick to try and build the kind of New Brunswick we want, that serves the common good, the public interest, and not the private interest.
It's sickening. It's sickening. It's not democratic. It's not democratic. You know, it's you can vote your politicians in. The only time they want to see you is every 4 years. That's it. What more can you say?
The sun should be shining in on what our government is doing. And so the Green Party would bring in a sunshine law to do just that. If I am fortunate enough to win a seat in the Legislative Assembly on September the 22nd, I will introduce a private member's bill to tear up this contract. It shouldn't be the case that a huge economic player in a province like New Brunswick also controls so much of the print media. That's not good for democracy. We need to change that, and the Green Party will change that.
who drove the Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Mi'kmaq from their traditional settlements. In violation of peace and friendship treaties signed with the British government, the natives were forced onto reserves, dispossessed of their land and resources.
Domination